Everyone, I'd say good evening to people on the East Coast and welcome to people on the West Coast and whatever time zone you may be in. My name is VanEck. I'm very happy to co-host this webinar with Melvin Escudero from Dorado Asset Management. Melvin, I think, is in Lima, Peru. I'm in New York, and very excited. One of VanEck is a macro manager. One of our goals is to be a responsible part of the financial industry and to help promote discussions about the benefits and costs of market structures in which we participate. This is the first of what I hope will be several talks on this topic. So as many of you know, I teach a financial history class to our interns, and the guest speaker several weeks ago, Daniel Paris, posed an interesting question. And he said, over the last 40 years, there have been two big trends that have helped financial markets. One is the adoption of pro-market or capitalist policies pretty much globally, which started in the 1980s, generally speaking, and then the falling of interest rates in the United States. So we're going to focus on one of those trends today. It will not be the fall in interest rates, but it will be the example that Chile set in this dialogue around adopting pro-market policies or neoliberal policies. And with that, I'm very excited to turn it over to our guest speaker, Sebastian Edwards. After his comments and some show and tell, Melvin and I will, and hopefully participants will ask him questions.
Jan, thank you very much for having me. I was very happy a few years back when we had a conversation on the abrogation of the gold clause in 1933 and how the price of gold went from $20.67 to $35. And if you look at what's going on today, that's a long time ago, or a very significant increase in prices. So what do I want to do today is talk about the first development that you mentioned from your previous speaker, which is the adoption of market-oriented policies. And I will focus on my recent book, the Chile Project, which has the story of how Chile, a Latin American country, middle of the pack, poor and with mediocre performance until 1970, after a violent coup d'etat, implemented market-oriented policies that generated, or I'm going to argue, generated a remarkable economic miracle. And it is an economic miracle that, however, had an original sin. And that original sin was the fact that the reforms were implemented at first by a dictatorship. So let me share the screen and go to my presentation. I'll try to be as brief as possible so that we can have a good conversation later. I'm told that, okay, so let's see, I need to do this. And I need to show the disclosure. So we'll go to the very end, show the disclosure. Now that we have done that, we'll go back to the very beginning of the presentation. And it is the Chile Project. Let me go back. Let's see. Here we go. Okay, so this is the book. It was published by Princeton University Press. And it came out about 8 weeks ago. And I'm happy to say that it's done very well. It's gotten very good reception, much better than what I thought. I thought it was going to be a niche type of book, and a number of people have been interested in this. So here is the Chilean miracle. The thick line is Chile. The other lines are other Latin American countries. And you can see that in the 1980s, Chile was sort of at the bottom of this group. And in fact, it had in 1989, an almost identical income per capita as Costa Rica and Ecuador. And by 2001, Chile goes from being in the peloton, in the middle of the pack, to being #1 in Latin America. And then it becomes #1 by a wide margin. And that is the first part of the miracle. And what we have here is poverty, the poverty measure. This is the percentage of people living below the poverty line. And we can see that it went from more than 50% to about 8%. So this is a miracle. And what prompted me to write the book was that in 2019, in spite of being the #1 country in Latin America, a revolt erupted. Demonstration, protest, and very violent demonstrations. And the demonstrators basically set the country on fire. And here we have some pictures that I took. And those of you in Latin America or that understand Spanish, you will see in the first slide, it says neoliberalism was born and will die in Chile. Here we see some barricades. I was trying to get close to them and not too close. Here you see the police in riot gear. And here it says, bye bye, ciao, Chicago boys. Okay, so this was the atmosphere in Chile in 2019. This demonstration led into two very important developments. On the one hand, the attempt to change the constitution and to transform the constitution, which had been instrumental for the economic miracle, into a very left-wing progressive constitution. That attempt failed, and now the country is going through a second effort to get a new constitution. And the second development that came out of the revolt and the demonstrations was the election as president of a young student activist, Gabriel Boric, a 36-year-old who had been leading the demonstrations and whose main political objective is to bury neoliberalism forever. In the last week or so, he's been at the center of a controversy in Chile because he went to an important meeting, a political meeting of heads of state in Europe, and he gave a very long and interesting interview to the BBC in London. And he was asked what was his political objective and whether it was true that what he wanted was to reform capitalism and adopt a capitalist system with a heart that had social values and social rights and reduce poverty. And he said, no, my objective is to debunk capitalism and to get rid of it, to replace it. He didn't say what he wants to replace it with, but that is what he's saying. So now Chile is in this situation where it's unclear which way it will go. Although I think that neoliberalism will merge into social democratic capitalism, but it will not disappear. Now, why is Chile interesting? I think it's important for two reasons. Again, one is the reason that you mentioned, which is that over the last 40 years, we've moved from a very active state in most countries to one system where the market prevails and there is a much lighter regulation. But also Chile is an extremely rich country when it comes to natural resources, similar to Peru, and we have Melvin here. So Chile has the #1 deposits of copper, Peru #2 in the world. Chile has some of the best locations for solar energy and for wind energy, has the #2 lithium deposits. It's very rich in other types of minerals because of its location and geography and climate. It has a tremendous potential, as Peru does, in terms of agricultural production and export. So it's a country that will play one way or another a very important role in the future. Electric vehicles, feeding the world, and so on and so forth. So it's important to understand what happened and where the country is going. Now, what is interesting is that Chile started from a situation where there were significant regulations. The market had a very small role until 1970. And at that point, Chile becomes the first country in the world that elects a Marxist as president. And that's Salvador Allende. And he is in place for 1,043 years he's in office. And then he's toppled by this coup d'etat on September 11 of 1973. And the military who take over politically don't know what to do in terms of the economy. And they ended up, after some struggle within the junta, citing or asking a group of economists who had been trained at the University of Chicago, the so-called Chicago Boys, to put in place a economic program for the future. And what they do is they start deregulating, privatizing, and this is what the book, the contents of the book, the different chapters. After a lot of tribulations and a few problems, they generate a very modern economic system where markets play a key role, not only in the traditional spheres where we think markets should operate, but almost everywhere. Okay, so when it comes to culture and the arts, they do it through markets. When it comes to education, they use market and school vouchers. When it comes to health, people can decide whether they use their tax is used to finance the public sector, or they can use their tax payments to pay for private health insurance. When it comes to universities, there are no free public universities. When it comes to pensions, there's no government-run social security. There are individual savings accounts. You go through area by area, markets, and what Chile does then, it is at the forefront of this revolution with the original sin. So I gave this morning an interview to a French outfit, and one of the questions that they asked me is, could this have been done without a dictatorship? And the answer is probably not, or with high degree of likelihood, no. And then the interviewer brought to my attention something that is very interesting, which I knew about, but I didn't know that he could have that level of knowledge. The Nobel Prize winner, Friedrich von Hayek, in 1985 or so, writes to Margaret Thatcher and tells her, look, there is this experiment in South America, which is amazing. And it is the Chicago Boys. And I know that you, Prime Minister Thatcher, you have done lots of good things and reforms, but you should go even further and you should do what the Chicago Boys did. And Thatcher's answer is, I understand, I have knowledge of what they did. I think that it is working very well. But Professor Hayek, we are a constitutional democracy, and we will not be able to put in place the kind of reforms that Pinochet has been able to put in place without using a democratic system. So we have to keep that in mind because it is a recurrent theme. Okay, so here we have the socialist president Salvador Allende and his economic team. They create a total mess between 70 and 73. That does not justify the coup, but it explains it. Inflation is almost 2,000%. There are shortages, black markets. You were saying, Jan, that VanEck is a macro wealth management company. A very important aspect in doing wealth management is exchange rates, currency values. And you look at where is sometimes the maximum profits, it's currency fluctuations. Chile in 1973 had 11 different exchange rates. So basically, if you wanted to buy wheat, you had an exchange rate, but if you wanted to buy barley, it was a different exchange rate, 11. Can you imagine the kind of distortion that they had? And then there is the coup, and these are two very famous photos about the coup. The one on the left is President Allende the day of the coup, just before the presidential palace is going to be attacked by fighter jets, and it's going to be bombarded. And he's wearing a helmet, and he has a machine gun, a submachine gun, an AK-47 that was given to him by Fidel Castro. So here is President Allende. This is his personal doctor, and this is one of his bodyguards. And this is a famous photograph taken by a Dutch photographer Chas Gerritsen, who, by the way, was then the still photographer of Apocalypse Now, the famous movie. So world famous guy that became famous because by chance he was in Chile and took this picture of Pinochet, which has made the rounds of the world. Okay, and these are the Chicago boys. This is the father of the Chicago boys, a professor at Chicago who then moved to UCLA and has been my colleague and my friend. Tomorrow he's going to turn 99 years old, but we are postponing the big celebration until he turns 100 years old. And his name is Arnold Harberger. He was the chairman of the Department of Economics at Chicago for about 12 years. And then he moved to UCLA. And these other guys are the other Chicago boys. Their names are not very important. And here we have inflation in Chile. This is a graph that I made for a presentation I gave at a talk I gave at Stanford at Hoover with John Taylor's group, and they are interested, of course, in the Fed and inflation and interest rate. So inflation went to 1,600%, and then it was reduced to about 4 or 5%. But it was costly bringing down inflation, because one of the tactics that they use, and we go back now to the issue of exchange rates, was that during this period here, they fixed the value of the peso to the dollar, but they did it at an artificial level. And if you fix the value of the currency in a country like Chile or Peru, for that matter, so one of the reasons behind Peru's success is that the central bank and our friend, good friend Julio, has never been tempted of fixing the value of the sol. If you fix the value of the currency and the price of your main exports change a lot and drop, in particular, the price of copper goes down, then that exchange rate that you have chosen becomes an artificial level and you cannot sustain it. And there was a huge crisis that generated this spike in unemployment, 26% unemployment. Eventually, this was solved, and then we have the miracle. Now, what is interesting about the miracle is that it happened, statistically speaking, during the central left governments that replaced the dictatorship. After Chile goes back to democracy, presidential elections in 1989 in December. The new president takes over in March of 1990. And to everyone's surprise, the team, the new economic team, people who had been in exile, who have been in jail, who had been prisoners, whose friends have been tortured, some of themselves have been tortured, instead of turning back to the policies of the Chicago boys, not only keep them, but deepen them. And we have that the miracle then takes place under the center-left government, but on the basis, the roots are take place during the Chicago boys years. Okay, and now there are some problems, and we try to explain the paradox of inequality and the paradox of the revolt. And I think that at the center of that are two things. One is inequality, and Chile here you can see the OECD countries. It has the second highest level of inequality. Only Costa Rica is high. Chile more unequal than Mexico. So that tells you more or less that now no poor people. Poverty has almost been eliminated, but unequal. And that was a very deep debate. If poverty is eliminated, should we worry about inequality? I think that the answer is yes. And the second problem has to do with pensions. And the main reason for pensions is that, let me see, here is pension, is that the payout once people retired in terms as a percentage of workers' wages before retiring is very low. You have Chile here, and you have other countries here, Brazil, you have Costa Rica, you have Mexico. So Chile, very low replacement rate. Only a few countries lower, and some people, and I know that we're going to talk about this, have blamed the system of private savings accounts. And I believe the system works, except that it has a few problems that can be solved, but were not sold in time. So I'm about to finish. A beautiful photo that I like is this one. This is Milton Friedman in Chile. Okay, so Milton Friedman goes all over the world, preaching the gospel of free markets. How do I know that he's in Chile here and he's not in South Africa or in Portugal or in another country? Well, this is the Chilean national TV logo. So this journalist here is interviewing Milton Friedman. That we know for sure. Okay. And so the constitutional reform now, since the attempt to change the constitution in 2022 failed, and now the country is going through a second effort, and we may want to talk about that. So let me finish with this. Neoliberalism was born in Chile. It generated a miracle. So there we have, and markets prevailed, but there was some fragility, an original sin. And then there are a number of people who want neoliberalism or markets to die in Chile, and they don't want the Chicago boys to be around anymore. So let me stop there, and I'll be happy to answer your questions or anyone's questions.
That's a great summary of the book and great slide, Sebastian. And I love the fact that the AFP was in those pictures of the riots on the far right. So I really want to start off with that, and then Melvin, I'll give you the next question, which is, as an abstraction, the idea of tying someone's retirement savings to the markets, and I would argue the success of the economy, it theoretically has a way of moderating political changes. Right. So, I mean, it would be suicidal, in other words, to just nationalize the economy and take away people's savings. And so if you think about the political pendulum in a lot of countries, there's a theory the AFP helps reduce by tying people to the economy more closely. It ties some of the political extremism. And that system has been adopted in Peru and Colombia to a similar extent. I guess my question is, A, what do you think about that theory? And B, what would you change structurally about the AFP system, having seen the political concerns and the fact that monies were taken from those pensions during COVID to sort of mitigate the effects of economic distress?
Okay, so that's a great question. So I think that in principle, your comments are right on target. So if your retirement depends on how the economy does, you don't want to screw up the economy, right? So you put the incentives where they are. It's incentive compatible. Now, what happened in Chile is that X% of the population did not believe that the monies were actually there. This is a country that has been poor. There's been a lot of corruption, not as much as in other Latin American countries, but still corruption. And people were sort of used to get promises that were not actually fulfilled. Now, what happened during COVID, as you said, was that many people lost their jobs and so on. So Congress allowed people to take money out of their savings accounts for retirement. And it was with a cap, 10% 3 times, so 30% total. And people did take that money out. In terms of, I think they took out about $40 billion, which for a $350 billion economy is a lot of money. And but what happened is that then people realized that the money was there. And what was amazing is that every time the Congress passed the law allowing for people to withdraw 10%, within 1 week, people had their 10%. If they had elected to do that and went through the web, they had that money deposited in their bank account. So it was with no glitch. Everyone was paid, with a small exception we'll go back to in a second. And then people realized, oh my God, the money is there. I do have that money. I got those statements, and it's not only just printed paper. The money is there, and there was an immediate change in attitude. And your theorem, which was theoretical, became then a real theorem in real life. People don't want to rock the boat, because if they rock the boat too much, they're rocking their savings, right? So that was a very, very interesting case. Now, just as at the anecdotal level, the only exception people could not withdraw their money was if they hadn't paid child support. And the courts then tied up that money, and child support had a priority over the person taking out their money. So as a collateral thing, it was good, right? I mean, you have this, the rules of law being applied even to child support. Yeah, you owe child support for your kids. Yeah, okay, your 10% before it's going to go there. So that was, it was not a glitch that it was introduced into the accounts. Now, why were the pensions so low? There are basically two reasons. One is that people contributed only for half the time that they were supposed to contribute. So the law was put in place in 1981, and the people who were required to make a deposit of 10% of their salary every month into their savings account were only people who had a formal job. So if you were an independent contractor, or you had a small firm, or you were a dentist or an accountant and you were a sole proprietor, or if you sold cold water in the metro, right? Or I mean, both. So I'm giving you the dentists were upper in the income scale, lower income people, but you were not formally an employee. You didn't have to make a contribution. What happens is that, as we found out, people through their careers, this is not Japan, and even in Japan it's not true anymore. People don't join a company and stay 40 years in the company. They are for 8 years there, then they become independent, they try a business, a small construction firm, or they buy, I don't know, a kiosk, and then for 4 years they try to do that. Then they go back and are formally employed for 2 years. And at the end, the median number of years of contribution is 20 rather than 40. So that immediately tells you you're going to get 1/2 of what the model said. Because the model was, the simulations were based on you work for 40 years. People work only 20. They contribute only 20. The other 20 they work, but they work in jobs where you didn't have to contribute. And the second problem was that the rate of contribution was 10%, which is 1/2 of the median for the OECD. Okay, our contribution to Social Security in the US is 12.5%, 625 employer, 625 employee. It's in some countries very high. Chile is 10%. So if you contribute or save 1/2 of the norm for 1/2 of the years, you multiply 1/2 times 1/2, you get 25%, right? And that is one of the reasons that this happens. So they've been trying to solve that problem, but in several ways. One is that independently, people that don't work as employees now do have to contribute. Okay, so you have to, just like in the US, if you have a C schedule, you still have to pay, and you haven't paid, you still have to pay Social Security. So that's beginning. It's not already done, and they are trying they're going to increase the rate of contribution to 16%. And there's a big debate there whether that 16% should go to the government and have a pay-as-you-go subsystem, or if it should go to independent individual accounts. And finally, they put in place a universal guaranteed pension that is a base that provides about, I would say, 80% or 90% of the poverty line. So if someone has contributed for 20 years and you have a sort of modest income, you get, in addition to whatever your savings will allow you to get, you'll get in addition 200,000 pesos, which is about almost $300. But it depends on the value of the dollar. It goes up and down.
Got it. So it's more AFP.
Yeah, so I think that the AFPs are going to survive. The question is whether this additional 6%, what fraction of it will go to individual accounts. It could be 4 points up to the 6. It could be 3 and 3. It could even be all 6% go to the private individual accounts, and the basic pension guarantee could go up. We don't know. This is one of the hot topics right now in Congress.
So you have just a follow-up, Melvin, I'll get to you next, but a follow-up, you had a front seat in the debates around the AFP system in Chile in particular. Do you see a lot of conversations with policymakers from other countries? Are they calling you and saying, hey, what's going on there? How's it going? How can we do our system better? Do you think there is a global exchange of ideas on policies like this?
There is less now than I would say 15 years ago. So 15 years ago, or whenever it was that we had President George W. Bush, he was a big fan of this system. And he even in one or two speeches talked very highly of the Chilean system and said we should emulate it. Now, one thing that has happened in the U.S. is that the 401k now you can have to opt out rather than opt in, and that is a combination of behavioral finance stuff that Richard Thaler at Chicago has been doing, and the understanding that private savings is very important. So people do talk to Chile. We get calls from all sorts of people, and the AFPs ask for advice. More than half of the portfolio is invested in international securities because Chile is a small country. In terms of, I mean, to get an idea, relative to GDP, it's as if the private managers in the U.S. would manage about, I don't know, $18 trillion. That's the percentage-wise that we are. It's a little less than 100% of GDP. So GDP in the U.S. now, because of the recent inflation, may be up to 24 trillion, something around there. So in Chile, the AFPs before the withdrawals were managing about 240 billion in a 300 billion economy, right? So relatively speaking, it's a lot of money. Now that means that it's also a big prize for politicians that want to put their hands on it.
Of course. I just wanted to remind participants you can ask questions in the Q&A. I think the question that's in there was just answered, though, so that was a perfect cue up. Melvin, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jan. Sebastian, it's really a pleasure to be with you. We are very excited here in Lima, in Peru. So, just following the pension questions, this is a very complex issue globally. No? Longevity is growing, and who will pay the bills is really a concern everywhere. Europe, US, Latin America. Just to finish the discussion there and enter to the book, do you believe that there is a standard model for pension system, something that could be a solution for everybody? Because always there are different points of views, and like the politicians, the liberals and the leftists always are crunching on this, and there will not be a solution. But do you believe that there is a model that could work for everybody?
No, well, I mean, the easy way out of for that question is to say that a mixed model is probably the best, that has a component that is what politicians and experts call solidarity-based, which is that current workers provide some financing to future workers, or pay-as-you-go, and savings, individual savings, which is the model towards which the US is moving, with the 401ks having more and more importance, and getting automatically enrolled in them, and you can opt out, but if you don't do anything, you are there, right? And a very basic pay-as-you-go. But as you say, Melvin, the demographics are against the pay-as-you-go system. So I teach my students, and I go back and I show them I ask them, pick a country. And I go back to 1965 or 1970, and the population pyramid is a pyramid. And now it's parallel lines, and you go forward, because it's pretty easy to forecast population structures, much easier than the weather or the economy. And you see that now they become like pagodas, like this, right? And there are very few young people that are going to be to support very old people who live longer and longer and longer. So pay as you go is really not an option. Now, one possibility is to have general taxes provide a basic support. And there is a discussion there of what kind of taxes. So solidarity, should those, how do we put in place solidarity? Should it be active workers paying for retired workers? Or should it be a broader solidarity? Everyone, capital and labor, paying taxes, and you use some of those taxes to support the retired people. So I think that at the end, the answer, it may sound like a cliche, a mixed system with basic pensions at the base, probably financed with a value-added tax, something that we don't have in the US, but you have in Peru, Chile has, it's all over Europe. There's been this recurrent discussion in the United States, having a value-added tax, and that would be a basic proposition, and then have the individual accounts going forward. Now, we go into Jan's second point when we talk about individual accounts. Interest rates go down, then you don't get the yields that, this is something that I didn't mention because I didn't want to get it into a longer presentation, Jan, but the original AFPs in Chile, the yield of the portfolio was 8% above inflation. So it was inflation plus 8%, and now it's inflation plus maybe 1.5 or 2%, right? This is because the savings glut in the world economy, the lowering of interest rates. We are now, the Fed raised rates today, and we say, oh my God, they are so high. We're just getting to the average of the last 40 years, right? So interest rates are low, they're going to stay low. That has implications for how much you have to set aside, and so on and so forth.
I want to continue doing a more personal question in 3 components. First, which was your relationship with the Chicago Boys? Second, how long is the connection with the Chicago University? Is it just at the beginning, or did it lasted until 2019? And third, do you support the main policies and why of the Chicago Boys?
Okay, so those are very, very, very good questions. So I got my PhD from the University of Chicago. So I am a Chicago graduate, but I am not a Chicago boy in the sense that I am not part of that tribe. I went to Chicago almost by accident. When I was very young, I was a student activist from the left. Although, as you know, I come from a very well-known conservative family, but I was a left-wing activist in the university. And for reasons that it would be too long to explain, I had to leave Chile in a hurry when the dictatorship started, about 4 years into the dictatorship. And I wrote something that offended some people. And I was told by my uncle and by my boss and by people I knew and from some friends of mine who were in intelligence in the army, you better leave. And I had a recently born baby. I was 24 years old. And the only place where I could go at the drop of a hat was to Chicago. My plan was to go to graduate school a year later when my daughter was a year old or a year and a half old, and I wanted to go to MIT. But I could go to Chicago because I worked for a Chicago boy. And he called on the phone Al Harberger, and he told Harberger, look, remember Sebastian, the kid that picks you up at the airport, that carries your bags, that mixes your gin and tonics, that looks for data. Do you remember this kid? And Al Harberger said, yeah, I remember him. And Rolf Luders at Chicago said, would you take him in as a student? He hasn't taken the GRE. He has not applied. He hasn't. And Al Harvey asked, who's going to pay for the tuition? And Rolf Luders, a Chicago boy who was my boss, said, we will pay for the first year. If he does very well, then you'll pick him up as a scholarship student. But if he does poorly, then he's on his own. And that's how I got to Chicago. So I am a Chicago graduate, but I'm not a Chicago boy. I never worked for the dictatorship, and I am very proud of that. Now, I am married to a Chicago girl. My wife has a PhD from Chicago. She did work for the dictatorship. She did work for the AFPs, and she is more conservative or, I don't know, right-leaning than I am. Okay? So that's how that's my relationship. I am very good friends with the Chicago boys. We have a very, we respect each other. We like each other. We visit each other in our homes. But I am not a Chicago boy. I'm a Chicago graduate. The relationship between Chile and Chicago goes back to 1955. And the very tight relationship lasted until about 1990, when Harvard moved to UCLA. And then he started bringing, he and I started bringing Latin American students to UCLA. That's Ivan Alonso, a number of other very highly respected Peruvian economists, Argentine economists, Chilean economists, Mexican economists came to UCLA. But there's still some relationship between Chicago and Latin America, but much less than before. Now, there's a very prominent, one very prominent, at least one, Argentine economist in the faculty of the University of Chicago, Fernando Alvarez. So that provides a connection to Argentina right now, but it's not the same as it used to be. Now, what do I think about the Chicago policies? I think that by and large, they are the right policies. I think that there have been a few extremes, but by and large, focusing on incentives, on rewards, on expectations, on the need to have fiscal balance, on understanding how monetary largesse creates inflation. All of that, broadly speaking, provides the right type of advice for running a country and running a company. Now, I know that I am right in saying that because Chicago at the end, in terms of economic policy, permeated everywhere. So if you look at people at MIT, they are very close to the old Chicago, everywhere. So in the war of ideas at the end, Chicago won. And now, Paul Krugman would say that I am not right, but I know I'm right.
Okay, Ian.
Well, I'm going to just read one of the Q&As that someone sent from Peru. Sorry, it skips back to the prior question, and it's about a 3-tier pension fund system in Peru. One is the basic state finance level. The second is an intermediate middle class income financed as usual today, 10% of income paid by the employee. And you already addressed how that's being adjusted in Chile. And a third level, premium income being paid by the same employee or employer as well. So that's a proposal in Peru today from Congressman Anderson. I don't know if Melvin, if you have a comment on that, or Sebastian.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, Peru also allowed withdrawals from the AFPs, and I think that having a premium level is the right way to go. Now, whether it's mandatory or you provide the incentives, tax incentives, and matching type of from companies, matching funds, or behavioral finance. I mean, I think that the fact that you get automatically enrolled and you have to opt out, is going to change things very dramatically, because as we know, there is this sort of bias in people's behavior of not doing anything. I mean, people get divorced and don't change. Lots of people don't change the beneficiary of their life insurance. The old spouse continues to be the beneficiary. And maybe you now are 3 spouses away from that one who's continues to get all the money in case you die, right? So there is this inertia, a bias. So I think that behavioral finance, if done properly, will be very, very important. And then, of course, the companies that manage the funds have to do a good job, because if they fail, or if there's corruption, or if someone runs away with the workers' savings and goes to Bermuda, then the system is going to get a bad reputation and it's going to be replaced. So regulation is very important, something that we often forget about, but having regulation that is modern, tough, but at the same time light. That's a great, I mean, a great challenge. How do you regulate in a way that they don't steal the money and they don't misuse it, but at the same time you allow their portfolios to adjust according to what's going on in the economy, right? So the regulation, the regulatory part is very important, and we often forget about it.
I'm going to go back to this big question about where are we going, right? We've had 40 years of capitalism. Chile's had 40 years of capitalism, but to a certain extent, maybe we're lost as to where do we go forward? And let me make that a more specific question. Number one, natural resources. Investors, there's a shortage of resources around the world, and the energy transition towards, renewables will only secularly increase demand for that. But investors these days punish companies dramatically that change their resources tax regime. So what investors are looking for, and maybe the government shouldn't care, is long-term reliability and predictability of I'll call it splitting the pie between the private companies that exploit resources, or develop resources, I should say, and the citizens of the country where those resources are found. So, in the mining sector and gold mining in particular, we see that there's the companies that are based in the U.S. and Canada, more reliable legal regimes, traded a premium to those that have assets in less predictable countries. So Chile's maybe in the middle. What do you see about that picture? And then maybe I'll ask you another one.
Yeah. So no, I think that it's very important, and your question is actually it's key, and it has several layers, right? I think that predictability is key, and one way I think to get predictability is through international agreements of this sort, for instance, which is not related to mining, but to companies in general, what the European Union and the US are trying to do with a minimal tax base for companies, right? And now there's talk about postponing that and so on. But once you have an agreement and everyone is on that boat, I think that you get predictability, because deviating from that boat may generate either sanctions or problems. Then I think that in mining, a big challenge is to develop and to devise intelligent royalty taxes. That's a very old proposition. David Ricardo, when discussing Adam Smith in the early 19th century, talks about rents, and we call them Ricardian rents, and that's the idea of a royalty. So how do you have royalty taxes that do not discourage investment at the margin, right? So that's a discussion that is going on, for instance, in Chile with regards to copper. So the price of copper goes up. There are windfall tax wins for these companies. Now, how do you split the difference? and you want to split the risk in a way that is fair, but at the same time does not discourage the companies from exploration and from improving the environmentally friendly type of investment. So we have a lot of challenges in designing regulations and so on and so forth. And I think, Jan, that a key issue here is going to end up, as you know better than I do, it's the issue of water availability. And how are we going to deal with that, since mining, and of course Melvin knows that very well, mining is so water intensive. And with climate change, water is becoming very scarce in a number of countries. So at some level, I know that you guys go to the very deeply this, but at some level, people don't understand, or many people, even educated people, policymakers, don't understand how complex the issue is. For instance, the desalinization plants. In Chile, for instance, Antofagasta is going through major desalinization programs, right? So it's a publicly traded company which is traded in the London Stock Exchange, but it is controlled by a family group, the Luxich family in Chile. And they are using, not surprisingly, Israeli technology. And then the environmentalists in Chile say, well, the percentage of salt in the water in the Eastern Mediterranean, where Israel is located, is very different from the Pacific. In particular, if you have the cold Humboldt current, and we're using the wrong technology, and we are adding to, I forget whether it is too much or too little salt back into the ocean, and then you say, well, how do you deal with this, right? And I'm sure we're going to solve that. We have some geniuses in Israel or in Peru or somewhere that are going to work out the techniques, but there are all these challenges that we have to look at, and I think that's the challenge. The investors want the return, but they want predictability. The communities in these countries don't want their lifestyles to change too much, but they want the income. And it's a juggling exercise that it's difficult.
I'm just thinking here, maybe one of the ideas is to, like, we have a strategic petroleum reserve, is to set aside some of those royalties, because my concern is a new government comes into power and they completely upset the apple cart, which is sort of bad for both parties, I would argue, long term. So maybe you set up this escrow account or reserve so that the current government doesn't get all the income that some is saved, and then the next government can kind of decide, okay, I can take out of that rainy day fund, but they can't change the deal.
Yeah, so that Jan, is a great idea, and it is similar to the Norwegian Wealth Fund and to other.
Right.
So Chile has such a wealth fund, and part of the copper income is set aside and put into this strategic rainy day fund, and some of it was used for COVID. Now, of course, the problem is that Codelco, being the largest copper producer company in the world, now is its profits are going down very quickly. It's almost not quite, but almost Pemex deja vu all over again. So remember, Pemex was a super profitable company, and now its profits are tiny, if there are any, and Codelco is losing money, and now it's trying to get some extra income in lithium. Some of us think that it's a bad idea that a government company goes into lithium. They should they should auction out the rights to mine the lithium, or I don't know if the verb is mining, because it's a non-metal. But the lithium, so yeah. So your idea of a wealth fund is a great idea, and it's tempting. Once you have it, it's tempting to change the rules when it's very big. But the Norwegians have been able to maintain it. And there was a finance minister in Chile who's now the dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics, Andres Velasco, a very good friend, who managed to maintain politicians away from the fund. He ran a fiscal surplus of 9% of GDP. Can you imagine? I mean, and the president herself, President Bashir, said, "Oh, we have now all this money. Let's build more schools. Let's do this." And Velasco properly and correctly said, "No, this is windfall gains. It goes into the rainy fund. We may want to use it and need to use it in the future." And he accumulated, I don't know, $25 billion, which for a small country, it's quite a bit of money. And then most of it was used during COVID.
Melvin, let me give you let's take one more question, each of us.
Okay, I just want to continue regarding the resources, natural resources issue. At the beginning of your comments, you mentioned the potential of Chile and Peru in the climate change transition, especially because of copper, lithium, clean energy, and other resources, and that these countries will play a big role in the future, 20, 30 years ahead. So 3 questions about that. First, which is your ranking of who will be the most benefited in Latin America? It's only Chile first, Peru second, Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, where are they? Second, when you see the history of the development of the countries, Australia, Canada, based their development in natural resources, but which is the arrangement between economics and politics? Because your book is about that. There is a marriage between politics and economics. How we could make an arrangement in Chile, Peru, and other countries in Latam to take advantage of this big opportunity. And the third question is, we need some sort of dictatorship structure to create this potential growth, because when we see the politicians and the different parties in all the countries in Latin America, it's really amazing. It's the atomization of the parties and the potential is difficult to believe that we will have a democratic solution, or which could be a potential solution for that.
Yeah, so let me start in reverse order. Certainly no dictatorial solution, okay? But this is something that, Jan, I don't know how aware you are of this. So I'm gonna give approximate numbers, Melvin, not exact, but approximate. So Peru has 15 political parties represented in Congress, 15, okay? I think it's 14 or 15. Chile has 21 political parties in Congress, okay? And you cannot run a country with that level of fragmentation. You just cannot. So the electoral and political system has to be changed, and it's very difficult to do it. And you need some enlightened minds to push for that. So what you want is to have very few political parties, ideally 2 or 3, and you want to have a system, I think, where in every district you elect only 1 member of Congress, like the US or the UK, or many European countries, only 1. Now, when you have only 1 person, what happens is that elect by district is that what economists and political scientists call the median voter theorem begins to work. That 1 representative cannot be in any of the extremes unless the district has people that are in one of the extremes. So AOC is the right representative for her district, but because it's a very progressive district. But in most districts in the US, you cannot have AOC, so you cannot have right-wing extremists, because they have to be in the middle. So we need to move in that direction, and it's not easy. And Chile is trying to do that. And one thing, Melvin, that Chile is doing is that it will establish a minimum amount of votes, national votes, for a party to even be in Congress. And it has to be, they chose 5% because that's the minimum in Germany. Now, Germany has a different system, which has 2 ballots, and it has the first ballot is only 1 representative per district, as I said. and the second ballot is national. But the notion that we need to reduce the number of parties, that in order for that to work, will require that the political parties are very open and democratic in the inside. So there's a lot of infighting, and Southern Democrats are very different from New England Democrats, who are very different from Midwest Democrats, right? But the fights go inside the party. And then you have a much more, this pendulum story that Jan was telling us about with the AFPs, then the pendulum doesn't move too much, because if you have fewer parties. And Chile is trying to do this with this cap. So neither Chile or Peru are going to work if they have this kind of fragmentation. Is it easy to do? No. Will it be done? I don't know. I think Chile is making some progress. Peru, unfortunately, is not. Now, which country is going to benefit in Latin America in the natural resources? I think that Chile has the greatest opportunity, I think, because of productivity, of the level of human capital. And I think the rule of law is deeper than in Peru, but Peru has a great chances. But in some sense, Melvin, it's the good companies are in both countries, and they are also in Colombia. So when I think about the future, and I know a little bit about mining, but not a lot, but I know a little bit, and I look at what is required, and I go through the list, and there is this one thing, that rare earths. And it turns out that the one company who has a rare earth project in Chile is a Peruvian company. So Chile has rare earths. It's in the Concepcion, Penco, Tomé area, so about 400 kilometers south of Santiago. And the project is running into some environmental problems because the activists don't want it to become successful because of our environment. But it is a Peruvian company, right? And we have Chile, Antofagasta is everywhere, right? So we are having, at the end, it's the companies that matter more than the country. Now, countries is very important because of the legal structure. And I already talked about that. And I forget what was the third question, which was the middle one.
No, how we could emulate Canada or Australia.
Oh,
the potential of this opportunity.
Yeah, so I think that from Canada, what we are trying to learn, I think, is how to deal with the First Nations. Now, I'm on the board of a mining company here in the US, and we had a Canadian member of the board. And I asked her, I was very excited because of this First Nations issue. And I said, well, you guys don't have to deal with Convenio 169 from the ILO. And she says, what is that? So the ILO indigenous consultation, how you call it, edict. The US has not signed it, Canada has not signed it. But Peru, if you go to mining companies in Peru, now one of the most important executives is the person who is in charge of the 169 and dealing with the indigenous people. So Canada has been able, I think, to move in the right direction. And I think we need to learn from them. So that's number one. And number two, something that worries me is that we don't seem to be training enough people in the mining technical fields in Latin America. So when we need to hire people that are either going to exploration or metallurgical experts or mining experts, we go to the usual places, the Colorado School of Mines, we go to Canada, we go to Colorado, again, other Colorado universities, Missouri, Canada, Australia, with lots of people from, but I don't see a lot of people coming from universities in Peru or in Chile, for instance. And that is something that I think we should worry about. Let me just say one last thing. One of the questions that, and I think that we're running to the end of this, but one of the issues that politically, and you, Melvin, mentioned the connection between politics and economics. Politically, one of the things the left talks about a lot in these countries is the need to move away from what they call extractivist industries, mining being, of course, the most important one, but also agriculture, because they say we're extracting water. So when Chile now is the #1 exporter of cherries, which are very important in China, and Chile has been able to produce cherries that have the same shine, the same size, the same taste, exact combination of sweetness and acidity that the Chinese consumers like. It's technically very complicated, right? But they use a lot of water. So the Chilean activists are saying, oh, we're exporting water, right? So one of the big issues is reducing extractivism, quote unquote, and diversifying the export, what they call the export matrix, what these countries export. And one way to do it is to export knowledge related to those industries where Peru and Chile have a comparative advantage. So Codelco is the #1 copper company in the world, and the #4 or 5 is in Peru. Why don't we export technology, engineering services? Codelco tried to do that. It created a subsidiary called Codelco Tech. It lasted for 4 years, then they closed it down because they couldn't get any big clients. But if you ask, Chile has the largest open pit mine in the world, 100 years old Chuqui. They have one of the largest underground mines in the world, El Teniente, old mines, and they keep finding more and more. But we don't export any knowledge, engineering services. We even get engineering services from the Spanish. I mean, I know Spanish engineers. They are not better than Peruvian engineers, Chilean engineers, but they export technology. We don't. So that's another challenge where I think we should work, and that it would be beautiful. I mean, if a company, a mining company wants to start working in a new deposit in British Columbia, why cannot they hire an engineering company that comes from Lima, Peru?
I think that's a great place to end, because in a way, your book, Chicago Boys, is about academia and academia interfacing with the real world. And you're effectively suggesting another, I'll call it learning or academic initiative. There have to be willing people from both sides to do that. And I think that's one thing I like about the Chicago Boys. It wasn't one group telling another group what to do. There was curiosity on one side and a desire to engage in an ongoing dialogue of which you've been part. So it was an honor to have you, Sebastian. Melvin, thank you for organizing this. And you can get a replay for this hopefully on somewhere on the internet. So have a great evening, everyone. Really, to me, a great discussion, because Chile, as an example, has moved so far, and you've explained it so well, that progress. And I think this webinar did a good job of laying out, it's a difficult agenda for us now around pensions, resources, and inequality, and the policies that will keep maybe not at such high growth rates, but people happy and moving forward for a better future. So thank you for your time.
Okay, so thank you, Jan, and thank you, Melvin, for having me. I had a great time, and hope to see you again soon.
Let's do it again. Okay, thank you.